Hello, this is the Blast Report podcast on all things blasting. My name is Evan Thibaud with New Wave Consulting, and I want to thank all the drill and blast teams along with those supporting them who are out there on the pattern. The production team at Blast Think and I would like to welcome you to today's episode of the Blast Report podcast. So you got 49 years of industry experience here in the explosives and mining industry, Paul, but we were recently just talking about a time when you were down in Louisiana in the salt mines, and you got to visit Cargill, which was, well, it was owned by Cargill when you went, and it was owned by Cargill when I worked there. But this is the salt mine that's under Avery Island. That all the Tabasco sauce in the world comes off of Avery Island.
Correct.
And there is a, and it's called an island, but it's a little hill in the middle of a swamp of a marsh. And there's a guy at the entrance of this island in a little wooden shack who has a baseball bat with a bunch of nails sticking out of it. And he threatens you on your first day of work. He says, if you drive over 9 miles an hour, these nails will go into your tire. And so, I had my very first industry job was at this salt mine in Avery Island. And when I found out that I was going to be working in the salt mine, they had, I was told after this interview, hey, you're going to work in a salt mine. And so what did I do? I Googled salt mining, and the first video to pop up was that Texaco drill rig that had drilled into a salt mine in Louisiana. Do you know what salt mine that was?
I don't remember the name of it right offhand, but they swallowed everything.
You said you met somebody. Now, I was terrified. I said, I said, I'm going to go work in a salt mine. No fucking way am I going to do that after seeing that video, because there was a 50-foot geyser coming out of the head frame, and the hole that they had drilled sucked in like 3 barges and left a dinghy tied to a tree like 40 feet in the sky.
Oh, yeah. All the water went down. That's for sure.
It's an unbelievable video.
I talked to the guy that was at a different mine there, and he had worked at that mine when that happened. And he said he's never climbed ladders so fast in his life because the water was coming up behind him, and they knew they couldn't float up. They had to climb out, and they made it.
Wow.
So pretty scary story there. But, salt mines, they're different.
They climbed up the ladder for that one out of one of their emergency escapes.
Yeah, so the hoist wouldn't work.
Could you imagine? I would assume that they would have been at a pretty low level, like the 500-foot level. Most of those ore bodies, they're like giant pimples from 20,000 feet below, and they come up, and that's what creates those islands. But climbing a 500-foot ladder
is very tiring.
Would be exhausting.
Yeah.
But when you know that water's rushing in, I'm sure that that's enough motivation for you to hustle up. Probably a lot of people joined a gym after that.
Yeah. Well, it's happened before. Where my dad worked in northern Michigan at a mine, which is closed now, the Painesville mine, they had a fire in the mine, down deep, pretty deep in the mine, 3,000, 3,500 or whatever. But a lot of guys laddered out and to get away from the fire. The farther you go up the ladder, you got platforms every so often, and you'd find lunch boxes and then tools and then belts and just about everything.
Less and less.
To get the weight down, yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, a lot of stories like that. There's another story. Is it Avery Island where you have to take the little barge across, or is that Cor Blanc where you take the
That's not Avery Island. I know that because that's where I work.
That was Cor Blanc. Then you take a little ferry across.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a good story. You drive onto this ferry, and they tell you to set your parking brake, and you drive across and then you drive to the mine, and they're real nice about it and all that. Well, anyway, they had an off-duty MSHA guy was doing training on the side. He had a side business, was there in the side business. So he was doing training on the weekends. So he came and put his car on the ferry, and went across and went to the mine, did his training. He came back and didn't set the parking brake like the guy tells you to. And the barge pulls away and the car went in the drake.
Oh,
Thank God it wasn't the government vehicle that went in, but the vehicle went in the drake.
And it was and he was
off-duty MSHA guy. So,
wow.
So all of us can make mistakes, including them.
Absolutely. I remember my very first experience with MSHA was at the Avery Island mine. And I was an intern there. It was first job in the industry, or in the mine, I'd say. And I went down underground, and the MSHA inspector was with me going through the shaft. And this was a beautiful old steam shaft that they still operated there. And it was mainly just a transportation for some of the engineers. And it wasn't part of the main production shaft or what the main personnel workforce would go down on in the morning. But I was always very nervous calling which level we would go to, whether it be the 500 level, the 700 level, and you'd ring a certain amount, and like I said, it's my first job, so I'm a little anxious and intimidated, and I know what happens when you work underground and you call the wrong level, or you call the surface by accident. And so, you ring 5 rings for the 500, it seems pretty straightforward. But if you give it just the wrong ring and you don't ring super clear, the hoist operator up on the surface makes you look like a real idiot, and he cancels your call and you have to call again. Well, I had called to the 500 level for us to get off with the MSHA inspector, and right when we got off on the level, the hoist operator he called for us to get off, and I went to undo the door and the latches for the shaft, and all of a sudden I get barked at by the inspector, and I'm just frozen right there. I'm like, all right, here it is. First job, I'm already going to get fired because I pissed off the MSHA inspector. This is it. And all of a sudden, our superintendent just starts barking back at the MSHA inspector. That he had told me that we were getting off at the wrong level when we were, in fact, getting off at the right level. And he didn't know because he wasn't familiar with the mine as much, right? And so it was just one of those experiences where, welcome into the mining industry. You're gonna have a nice experience getting yelled at immediately. And right after that, we went and we were surveying the mine site, and a friend of mine, my boss at the time, he had taken his hard hat off so that he could see through the total station. And right then, the MSHA inspector comes up again and tells him, "Why don't you have the hard hat on?" And he's like, "Well, it's been on all day. I just had to take it off so I could look through the total station." And he's like, "Put it back on." So he went to look through the total station, and the bill of his hat just, knocks into the total station. So there's an argument that ensues there, and it's just quite one of those experiences that you learn about real quick when you have to deal with who is an inspector versus who is your coworker or things like that. There's different attitudes with everybody in the mine site.
Oh yeah, some people want to help you, and some people could care.
It was really crazy. I don't think I'd ever really want to be an inspector, regardless if it's MSHA or not, simply because I when that inspector left the office that day, there were really, really thin walls in the building that we had in the engineering office. And as soon as he had closed the door and started walking down the stairs, I remember the superintendent saying, "Man, that guy, like, he just cursed him out right there. But they had just been talking about kids and family and the whole thing for like all day riding around the mine site. And I just remember thinking, I don't think I ever want to be an inspector where someone might have to drive around with me all day and act like they care about me. I hope that's not the case.
That's good.
Now, did you ever get down to any of those salt mines in Louisiana?
Yeah, I worked in. I didn't work in Morton, but at Cor Blanc and at what was the one you were at?
It was Cargill at the time.
Cargill,
Avery
yeah.
Island.
Both. I was Cargill at Avery Island and in Cor Blanc. So they're really hot. I was amazed, hot and then actually pretty dry.
It's unbelievably dry. I mean, to be in a salt mine and when you sweat, you itch because of how dry it is in the air.
Yeah. Well, the best part was that they had those frozen things like kids have, those squeezy deals,
Mm-hmm.
And they had a big freezer of them down there in Cor Blanc. So we got to have those. It was that. And when I came up at, I think it was at Cor Blanc or Avery Island, we had to come up to secondary. And it was 97 degrees, and it was just pouring water down the shaft, and it felt so good to stand in that water after being down there all day,
So I think Avery Island had a different bedding system, so we weren't as hot as some of the other sites, but it was a very weird experience because I've never been in underground coal, but I was told in underground coal a lot of times the walls are all white because of the limestone that they cake the walls with for safety, so that to keep the dust down. But when you go to underground salt, everything's black from 50 years of diesel particulate matter caking the walls until you get to the face, and then you're sitting there in this very weird dystopian winter wonderland that is it feels like you're walking on snow. It's as slippery as ice itself. You could slip and bust your ass just stepping out of your pickup truck. And yet it's really, really hot, and you could still do a snow angel, but it's a salt angel,
Yeah. It's a different world. Salt's a different world, as far as
it is. And so you did some, you were salt blasting at the time. Is that what you went there for?
Yeah, they had some problems, and we were there. I was there to help them with it.
It's quite an interesting application of blasting salt. It's not like blasting any other kind of rock, right? I mean,
no,
it's elastic and
they do undercutting there. You don't see that much anymore. They undercut with those big saws, and it's a different deal.
The horizontal saws, right? I mean, they're like 15, 18 feet long chainsaws, essentially.
Basically, that cuts a kerf underneath the, right across the floor.
And that provides that free face, right?
Yeah.
Now I know some companies they had a really large drill, and they would do a burn round essentially instead of the undercutter.
That's in the northern ones, like at Cargill and Cleveland.
Okay.
Cargill and New York, a couple of them up there. They use what they call a smag drill.
That's right.
It has three drills that drill 11-inch holes, and they drill 3 and 3, so they have 6 11-inch holes in their burn. And then they just break to those holes. So, yeah.
And is there a reason between picking those instead of the undercutters?
From what I understand, that they own the smag drill company, so that's how they got into it. But they did. It came from Europe, and they were doing it in Europe. They got away from undercutting a long time ago.
I was told that those big chainsaws were some German company.
Well, it could be originally, and that's where the smag drills are made now.
Okay. My very first blast underground outside of the experimental mine at University of Rollo, where I went to school, we shot a scale down in the there was about 175 foot backs roofs in the benched area of Avery Island. And there was a scale that was quite large, and they needed to blast it. And during the normal operations, there would be a shift change during the blasting process. But because it was a scale, we actually got to be there for the blasting. And it was what an unbelievable sound to be able to pull the trigger and hear the boom and the reverb itself, and to feel the differential of the pressure, but then to hear it fall and hit the ground as well.
Yeah, it's a great experience. So.
Yeah, I think that was the moment where I said, I like mining, but I got to stick to the blasting. I think at that point, it's like, I don't really want to be a mining engineer as much as I want to be a blasting engineer.
Yeah. Well, it's always, you like to hear the bang, and then there's good and there's bad to that. I can remember when I was young and dumb, and back when I was at White Pine, we did room and pillar mining, and we'd go down 2-3 pillars from where the face was at and sit against the wall, and with our back to the wall, back to the blast, basically push the button so we could watch the rock fly by. Never thinking that it might ricochet, hit the pillar, bounce back and get us, so.
Right. Wow.
And that all, it's all young and dumb. You do some of that stuff, but even older people, it's very important to keep the mapping up and stuff like that. When I worked at White Pine, we retreat blasted out of the mine because the mine was very big, 5, 6, 7 miles to the face sometimes, in these different work areas. You just read the farthest one shoots, and then you shoot, and then you shoot, and you're all lined up in these Jeeps. And they're coming out of the mine one day, and they pull up, and there's like eight of us in these Jeeps, 8 Jeeps lined up behind or man cars, whatever you want to call them, lined up. And they pushed the button, and it was a breakthrough round, and it blew the first Jeep away. Killed both guys. Nobody had realized it was a breakthrough round. The maps weren't up to date. That's one of the things about engineering. You've always got to be up to date on your maps. But
wow,
I mean, just that quick.
And there was not even unaware of this being a risk. We're just gonna sit here. There's a blast on the other side, and we're gonna.
Yep. Nobody even thought about it.
And this is what year was this?
Back in the 70s. That's why I say safety wasn't as big a thing, That's why MSHA came around,
And that's another reason why we've got this podcast, is to share these kinds of stories of what did it used to be like, and what are some incidences and the learning lessons there is. Now a lot of times, most mines are at, I would say, you could probably correct me if I'm wrong, most people aren't even allowed to be underground during the blasting, except for the blasting crew.
Yeah, well, that's all we had was a blasting crew too at that time. Everybody else was out, but it was still not good.
Still not, yeah. And so they were because the mine maps weren't up to date. That wasn't one of the concerns. That wasn't even thought about.
At that time, yeah, they were behind. Like everything, it's hard to keep everything up, but you need awareness, especially blasters do, and drillers. That am I going to break through? A lot of times, you might be within a foot and not know it by not getting off the drill, getting out, walk around the pillar, and look at the other side, or maybe get a tape out and go, "Oh, this is going to be close."
Mm-hmm.
Something you got to definitely be aware of. So, wow. But safety it's come a long way though, but back then, I can remember when I was a blaster, and there wasn't a lot to do in the morning. We'd go kind of hide in the mine, with our rig, because there's nothing drilled out usually on our shift. And then we could load four rounds in before the end of the day, starting at noon. But on some days when we were in a real hurry, we had a platform built that fit between the booms on the jumbo. So when he was coming down the face, we were up on the platform loading holes behind him.
Wow. So you were okay. So you have you're loading you got 2 different arms of the jumbo drilling, and while it's drilling, you and your partner are on a platform in between them, loading the holes that would already been drilled with AMFO.
Yeah, AMFO and primers, which were dynamite primers in those days.
Electric or non?
Yeah, electric.
Electric.
So every now and then, it was funny because the wire would go down and get caught on the drill steel and start wrapping up real fast. We'd put a hand up and the guy turned the drill off, So, and then it was just something that we did because we wanted to get more rounds faster,
Right.
No concern about safety. And then, it was back to bonus. In fact, so one of my first jobs after I got out of 10T training at White Pine, I was a misfire driller. And that was before I knew nothing about explosives, and I didn't know what a misfire driller was, but it paid 2 job classes more. So, man, I'm right in there.
And
me and the foreman would go, and he would say, "There's a misfire here now. Turn it on real slow," and we would actually try and wash the hole out with the drill. And then, every now and then I'd hit the hammer. No, set the hammer off. And slowly, wash till we could get the primers out, and that's how we cleaned our misfires out.
Yeah, so I was at a underground mine recently, and I heard a unique story where we were talking about clearing misfires, and MSHA has a rule that says only jobs necessary to remedy the misfire can be done. And so this operator was in there, and they were scaling they were scaling the back so that they could get in there. And one of the inspectors, not going to sound like I'm bashing MSHA in this episode, I really don't mean to, even though I've said a few bad stories here, but the inspector went to write them a fine, and they argued saying the scaling was necessary in order to make sure it was safe to then go access that misfire and handle that misfire and wash out that misfire. But when the inspector showed up, they just thought they were scaling like a normal round would be, as if it was part of their normal operation, so they had to fight that to show them that is part of the 30 CFR was to get in there and mitigate what they could so that they could take care of the misfire, right?
Yeah, and misfires are a big deal, and they're bigger than underground, I think, than they are on the surface, because you can see it on the surface, and underground you can't always see it. And underground miners are they're proud of their work, and they're not going to tell you if they've got one. They're going to try and get rid of it. And at one mine, this was just 5 years ago, the standard procedure was to drill them out. I mean, with a hammer running. And I'm not going to say what mine, because you worked there too. Mm-hmm. And that was the standard procedure. And then one day it went off and did not kill the operator, scared him. And they had to come up with a procedure after that, So it was still a standard procedure. Here we are in 2000s or 1900s, 1990s or 2000s. I guess it'd be in the 2000s. So people were still late 2000s. Yeah, people were still drilling out vast misfires.
Now, did the person know it was a misfire, or did they think it was a bootleg?
Yeah.
They knew for sure. Wow.
No, a lot of times people think it's just a bootleg, but you don't know what's down there, unless you wash it out.
Right, and they just go to collar the new hole. Hey, look, there's a bootleg. I might as well collar in that hole.
Yeah.
Without checking.
Yeah.
Goodness. Yeah, that's a nightmare. I have heard.
Go ahead.
I've heard of many situations where, underground, you have a lot less light. You're mucking in there. It's a different crew even. Which is similar to having a different crew on the surface, but without all that extra visible light. And people didn't used to dye their product. It used to just be the same color in a limestone. It would be the same color. It was before people started to dye their diesel and things like that. So it wasn't as visible or even talked about. People would, like you said, people would never, even today, a lot of people don't admit their misfires or their mistakes, which is, I think nowadays people will admit their misfires, but they'll mitigate it really quickly and discuss it after the fact and instead, which is okay. But as long as they're doing it safely,
Yeah. And that's the big thing is you cannot, that's why you got to retrain all the time is people want to take shortcuts and every one of them rules in that MSHA book is there for a reason because somebody got killed.
That's a very good point, and
if we didn't have anybody get killed in the mine, there would be no MSHA book,
Yeah, as much as, people like myself would like to, share a story or a complaint about an inspector, they're there for our own safety because it's needed.
Yeah.
It's absolutely needed. That's a good way to end this episode. Thank you again for coming on and sharing some stories and chit-chatting with us.
Always glad to.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Blast Report podcast. I want to thank the team at Blast Think for producing this show, and please follow along for more episodes in the future, and share this podcast with your colleagues so we can continue to honor our industry and the people in it. Be safe and have a blast.